A'udhu billahi minash shaitani rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum and good evening. Welcome to On the Couch with me, Farida Rabia and Soki and Cincy. This is 100.4 FM, where you hear the difference. Your weekly show that discusses current affairs in political landscape pertaining to housing, from evictions, equitable access to land, and tenure security. Today we will cover social housing, what it is, why we need it, and how this housing tool is working in our country and in our city. Our lines are open 021 699 1786 or WhatsApp us 0786 10 11 12. In studio, we have Malcolm McCarthy, consultant, Bushle Boy, Difano Kwazi, head of political organizing, and Anthea Houston, communique CEO. Welcome to On the Couch.
Thank you. Good to be here.
How are we feeling this evening?
Very good.
I thought you guys were going to say very cold. I was going to say, I agree. I'm super cold, but it's fine.
We're just happy to talk about our favorite subject, social housing.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, favorite subject. So with this favorite subject, we have a scenario, as always. So Peter Lowe, 62-year-old man, is renting in Seapoint for the past 37 years. And at the moment, the landlord is evicting him and he has nowhere to go to. Peter has been on the housing list for 37 years. It's a very long time. The government speeding up the release of land for housing and using well-located sites like the Tafelberg site could see someone like Peter being accommodated in an area he has lived half of his life in. So, Mr. Malcolm, what is social housing? How do we qualify for this? And who builds it?
I think social housing is a government-subsidized rental program in which the government provides some of the money to actually build the structures. The tenant is expected to pay a rental as well. Mm-hmm. And generally what the program tries to do is to actually make sure that these buildings are actually built in areas where people would not normally, low-income people would not normally have access to decent housing. So if you look in Cape Town, there's a range of different spaces and places that this has been targeted at, like Salt River, Woodstock, and Seapoint, and other areas. And the way in which you can qualify for this is if you are a South African citizen or you have permanent residence, you over the age of 18, and you have a dependent. But what's also important is that you have the ability and the willingness to pay the rentals, because the rentals are very subsidized compared to what you would normally get in the market in those areas. But there are still rentals and there are still strict rules about it. And these units are usually developed and managed by independent social housing institutions like Communicare. And Anthea, I'm sure, can say a lot more about that.
Mm.
Yeah, so based on that criteria which the government has set, as Malcolm explained, the person older than 18 would need a dependent or need a partner. And so your case study, Peter, would in fact not qualify for social housing. But social housing is just one of many government subsidized housing programs. It is a rental product. Government also has subsidies to upgrade informal settlements. That's not part of their social housing program. They also have subsidies for people who are buying, sort of first-time home buyers who just buying a house on the open market. That's not social housing in South Africa. And then also they have the free housing program, the RDP housing or BNG housing, what people know, the houses that government build that they give away for free. That's also not part of the social housing program. So there's a whole suite of housing support coming from the government. And social housing is just one of those programs that's targeting a particular category of people in South Africa who are able to pay rent, and it's giving them the opportunity to live in neighborhoods that are quite well resourced in terms of the infrastructure that's already there, already clinics, schools, roads, close to job opportunities. And that's because we can only build social housing in particular zones that government has designated for social housing that are already well resourced. So that though we're asking people to pay rental, they're saving on the exorbitant transport costs because they're not commuting from far away outside of town. And because those rental complexes are located close to economic opportunities.
And maybe most importantly, in the context of the criteria that is looked at, most SHIs look at the ability of the tenant to being able to pay rent. So I think that's very important because they look at your ability to pay rent, basic services that you'll use, and they'll go through a series of things such as your background check and so on to make sure that you'll be able to pay your rent. But also, if a person has a bad history or bad record in terms of a debt, also people might struggle to qualify for social housing in that sense.
Yeah, and I think also just to add to that, the income range targeted are people earning between 1,800 up to 22,000 Rand a month. And normally on a social housing project, you'll find that they try to make sure that, and they have to, in terms of government regulations, make sure that there are rentals that are affordable across that whole range. And that means rentals that can range from about 850 Rand to 6,000-7,000 Rand, depending on the area.
And importantly, in this context of rent, there is a misconception out there about social housing being a rent to own. It's a strictly rental stock and rental arrangement. So it's not a situation of renting to own those stocks or the apartments that people stay in.
Thanks for that point, Bukhle, because people often misunderstand that if they paid rent for a year or 2 years or 3 years, that they should eventually own it. What the government has said is that even when you're benefiting from social housing, you remain eligible for a free house.
Yeah.
Okay. So you could still be on a waiting list for that kind of housing where you could own later, but you don't eventually own the social housing. The other common misperception is that the stock is owned by government. Now, there are 1 or 2 social housing institutions in the country that are actually government entities who, they were set up by the government, formed by the government, and the stock that they own, therefore, is government stock. But most of the institutions that own social housing in our country are independent non-profit organizations who's just working with the municipality and national government to increase the supply of housing. So that stock is actually owned by the institution itself. We are all subject to the social housing regulations, so there are rules about how we must manage it, rules about how we can escalate the rent, and as Malcolm has described, who we must target and how much rent we can charge. But as long as we play by those rules, it remains our stock, and it remains at the discretion of the social housing institution how it works with its tenants, as long as it's behaves within the few regulations that have been put in place to protect the tenants.
I'm just going to ask that you repeat that again, because a listener has sent in a question. This houses, is it to buy? Where can I search? What is available? So just to repeat again, because our last conversation when we had that, I did ask the question because social housing is a one of the ways we are getting people into homes and off the streets and so on. But is there an option for the person if they wanted to? Could they own? So you guys just clarified that you're going to rent.
Well, I think that the social housing program, as we're talking about tonight, is a program that's only for rental. And the reason why it's only for rental is it's often done on land which is very, very expensive. And if you're going to be putting a lot of subsidy in it, you want to be able to provide opportunities to many different households, whereas if it was sold, then what it would do is it would disappear into the market. And we know in Cape Town the land market is extremely expensive.
Yeah.
So it might serve one family, but it will never serve another family in the future. And I think that's quite important. But I think it was Anthea who's already said that there is another program, if you're going for ownership, called FLISP. And I don't think we've got time to talk about it tonight, and maybe if you wanting to bring it to the couch on another occasion, it might be very interesting.
Of course. Just thinking about what you said, Ms. Anthea, really the whole thing about owning, I think it's just within the culture of South Africans. We want to own what we have, and I know that social housing is just a means to help us get to where we need to get to. But so with Peter's scenario, he still stands a chance to get a free house if he lives until that time.
Yes, I think we must recognize there's a historical context in South Africa. People were denied, black people were denied ownership of property. And that's why I think in the hearts of every citizen here is that desire to own for the security and the peace of mind. Rental does still give people security in the sense that you, as long as you have a lease, you have a right to be where you are as long as you honor your side of the contract. The landlord cannot do anything they like. They cannot terminate your lease except in terms of the agreement of the lease. And if the landlord behaves irregularly or doesn't stick to the agreement in the lease, the tenant has recourse at a rental tribunal. They can approach our rental tribunals. In Cape Town, the rental tribunal is very active. You can approach the tribunal, make your case, and the tribunal has findings, 4 tenants or 4 landlords, depending. The landlord can also approach the tribunal if a tenant doesn't stick to their end of the bargain. But so there is security in the rental form of tenure. But we understand the historical context that it's not anyone's first prize to be a tenant. We really, as South Africans, we want to own. And in the case of your example of the man who's renting in Sea Point now, he can remain on a list for that free RDP house. But government's housing delivery, although our government has delivered more housing than anyone else on our continent, the backlog in terms of housing need and the growth in our population is just insufficient to meet. So the reality is that Peter would probably be waiting, for decades before he's in the front of the queue for that free house.
But one of the other things is that he would have to expect to move away from where he has been living, because if you look at the history of BNG and RDP housing, most often it's delivered on much cheaper land, which is on the edge of the city. And that means he would then be expected to move much further out, and he would have all the costs of commuting. And very often, although not always, he would have a less well-developed service infrastructure.
And maybe important to that, because what that creates is what exactly social housing is trying to work against. The spatial injustice that people are being pushed into the peripheral areas. Maybe it's very important then to speak about maybe the genesis, if you like, of social housing, because it has its root. Malcolm will speak more about this. It has its root, as I understand it, in the context of in the apartheid era, because what you would understand is that the majority of people were being relocated from well-located areas of land into townships, and very segregated townships. And what you began to see in those circumstances was overcrowding of these areas. And in response then to this crisis, that was there, the government launched a series of programs, and part of those programs being the Reconstruction and Development Program, the RDP, that Malcolm is speaking about, which has its own challenges in the context of the inadequate funding of it, the corruption that hampered the building of this, and the bureaucratic delays, and social housing then was established in response to some of those things, to say that but let's bring back people into well-located areas, working class families who earn lower income to come back into these spaces. So this entire scenario with Peter is just speaking to the recreation or of spatial injustice, which is what social housing is trying to really move away from and trying to bring people into these well-located areas in that sense.
And I think another link between social housing and owning your own house is that because social housing actually gives you the opportunity to live much more central area, in many instances it's likely to increase the opportunities for employment or access to employment. I think Anthea's already mentioned that it actually reduces your travelling costs quite substantially because of generally of your location. So there are a number of tenants who actually use it as a base. So you stay in that rental accommodation maybe for 4 or 5 years. But during that period, you're establishing, first of all, a good credit record. Secondly, what you're doing is that you're increasing the amount of savings that you might be making. And then on the basis of that, you're in a much better position to go to a bank or somewhere else and actually take out a loan linked to the FLISP subsidy from government and find purchase. But you won't purchase in that block. You would have to purchase in another area probably, because the areas in which social housing is happening, the land values are just so high that it's very difficult to turn it into ownership.
Yeah, and that's why it's really so critical that the state releases land and makes land available for social housing, because we're trying to locate this housing in well-resourced neighborhoods. And across the country, pretty much those neighborhoods in areas that are thriving economically, those are sought after neighborhoods in a country where the economy is struggling and where jobs are scarce. So land, house prices and land prices in those neighborhoods are the steepest. And so we look first to government to say, what land do you have in those pockets? And can you lead by releasing that land? And there are pockets of land in well-resourced neighborhoods. Sometimes they were meant for a park, but there's already sufficient parks, or they were meant for a school, but there's sufficient schools, or there's underutilized government owned properties that are not, fully operational, that can be released. And that's why there's a lot of noise in our amongst advocates for social housing, calling for government to really kind of unlock key land parcels and key sites where we could be developing land and turning it into social housing complexes in which people could live. That's quite critical for us to see happening at a much more rapid pace. There has been a pickup in our city lately, but in all honesty, it's coming, after 10 years almost of a bottleneck of land release, and we need a lot more of that to happen in Cape Town and also in other parts of the country.
I mean, one particularly interesting area in Cape Town would be Salt River Woodstock, where the city has been doing a lot of work on preparing land which could be released in that particular area. And for me, that's very interesting, because if you actually look at the rental market in that area, you're not able to find a flat easily for less than 8,000 rand, which means that it's totally unaffordable to almost 70% of the people in the city of Cape Town. When we get social housing there, you'll have the possibilities of people, depending on their income within the range we've already talked about, having rentals between 900 rand and 5,500 rand, which will make it a great deal more affordable to live in an area which is extremely well located in relation. But it will be dependent upon the municipality releasing the land to allow this to happen. And the important thing is, because of the way in which the social housing program is structured, the land doesn't get released to some private developer who can next year go off and say, oh, I started with low rentals, but I'm charged higher rentals. It's actually released to institutions that have a regulatory responsibility to the Social Housing Regulatory Authority. And although they have a chance to increase their rentals, CPI plus 2, but they cannot set market rentals for their units. And that's very important, because it means that if that land is made available and the development happens, it remains accessible to people on low and moderate incomes.
There's a question or a comment that came through. I am a backyard dweller. Went to Wales Street in town for housing subsidy. To buy a house, was told must be 10 years on the list. I'm disabled, deaf, and have bad arthritis.
I mean, it's there's a very serious problem. If the caller is saying that they're wanting to buy a house, it's a separate type of question altogether with someone that is wanting to get into social housing. In that sense. And the question of being on the waiting list in that sense is a process of trying to get people closer to different forms or programs or your list and so on. And there's I think one of the important things to note here is that there isn't clarity about the waiting list in itself, and the waiting period, how long people have waited there for 20 years on that waiting list. People have been waiting for housing for over 20 years. So that's a very serious problem in terms of housing delivery that we're facing. I think that's something that we need to address, and that's why Anthea was speaking about the importance of land release, that land is released so that people, there are more development so that people can access housing. That's what's important in the midst of the housing crisis and people on the waiting list. There's more land that needs to be released so that people can access well-located housing, and that's what I think everyone needs to advocate for. And very important to it is the site that Peter, the scenario that I was speaking about of Tafelberg. We know that it has been in litigation for many years, and there's nothing that's stopping the Premier in the province in terms of releasing that site for housing for people. For domestic workers, for security guards. Those are people with conditions like the caller of disability and other stuff can access housing. That's why it's very important that land at the heart of it is released so that people can access housing.
Yeah, Buhle, I think you're quite right. This caller, this comment from the caller is, I think, it's representative of the reality for most people in the city. They're wanting to find a way in to ownership in the market, and you go to the Department of Human Settlements and they cannot assist the folks because there is just not enough supply. And I think why people like me are working on social housing and Malcolm is because we can see that while people are waiting, they are meeting their own housing needs. How are they meeting it? They're paying someone rent for a backyard, for space in their backyard. They're paying to rent to perhaps put up a shack in an informal settlement. They're paying for rooms. We're in that same space. All of that is a form of renting. What we're doing is giving people just a more dignified rental option in a better resource location. And the point about land release is so critical, and maybe I can give an example of a case study that we're busy with at the moment. So the city has recently signed an agreement with us to release the Salt River Market site to us. Now, in that area, there's lots of overcrowding. There are some informal little settlements of people, living on the streets in the Greater Salt River Woodstock area. With the city releasing this land, we're able to do at least on that site 250 social housing rental opportunities while those people are waiting for this free house to come from the government, because we're able to not only use the government subsidies, but in our case, being an older social housing institution, because we're able to actually put much more money than most other social housing institutions would into this development. We're actually able to not only do those 250 social housing opportunities, we're going to go much higher up than normal. Normally we would only be able to do social housing that's about 3 or 4 stories because of the small grant we get from the government. But we're going to bring lots of other money into the project, and because of adding that other money, we're going to be able to get our social housing units up to 300 in Salt River, and then also add about 700 apartments in just that next layer of the market. Now that may sound like it's lots of housing for rich people, but the people who will end up living in that next layer are teachers, they are public servants working in the city council, they are nurses who are struggling to find something to buy in that area and in any other area. So there's a massive housing crisis, and we can do this only because the government has released the land at an affordable price, and that's allowing us to complement their money and to deliver more to people. If we had to go and buy that land, we would not be able to do that 300, even that 300 social housing apartments.
Time it's running fast, but I did quickly want to talk about Tafelberg and it being sold to a school for school, and then there was a court case. Can we quickly talk about that? And then what's the plan with that land?
I mean, as I've already said, that there's a very long history around that particular site, and at the heart of it has been working class people, working class families in Sea Point, saying that we want a place to call a home in this area. And we know Sea Point is one of the wealthiest areas of Cape Town, but also very, in terms of character, very wide in terms of its racial character. And black families, working class, saying that we need a place to call a home. We work in Sea Point. We cannot be commuting and using a third of our salaries into transportation. Invest in development of housing, so that as domestic workers, security guards, we can stay closer to where we work, and our kids can go to schools in very well located areas. And there's and that site was being sold to a private entity, and people of Sea Point rose to say that it cannot be that in the middle of a housing crisis, that a public parcel of land is being sold to a private entity when it could be used for its social value, to build housing that is very much needed for social integration in that house. So I mean in that area, and it went to court, and the people, members of Reclaim the City, with the support of the general public, managed to stop the sale of Tafelberg, and now we're at a stage where the province is really challenging whether there's obligation to advance special justice, and we are saying that they have, and it has gone to the SCA, the Supreme Court of Appeals, trying to still discuss this question of the state's obligation on Tafelberg. So there's nothing in the main that is stopping the provincial government in terms of developing that site outside of the legal processes that are happening. It's just a lack of political will from the Premier of the Western Cape in terms of developing that site and handing over that site to a social housing company that would be able to develop it for its social value of housing. Maybe they can give it to...
But I think that when I was working previously in Nasho, we actually did a fairly strong feasibility study on that particular site, and we showed that even if we developed as what we call a mixed market site, so some very expensive units as well as social housing, we would be able to get something, we would have been able to get about 240 units on that site and still pay the province a substantial amount of money for the land. Now, if the province was to release that land on the same basis as the city is releasing land at 10% of the market price, you would find that we would get substantially more than 230 units on that site. It could be possible, and I say this without having done the details on it, to get up to 400-500 units on that particular site. And what a important point of economic integration that could have in a fairly sort of what's becoming a more and more rich area in which poorer people are actually excluded, even though they're the people who actually come in and do a lot of work in that particular area. So it's we wait to see what legal progress is made, but it's so sad because it's wasting a huge amount of time and a lot of opportunities sort of going down that particular route.
Billions are spent on just litigation when that's the money that could be going to, when that's actual money that could be going to development. And it's not just about Tafelberg alone. There's also the question of military sites that ought to be released for development of housing. And I think that's a very important thing that the state needs to respond to. Also, HDA, we're told that some of these military sites are being released to them for development. But we need actual plans in terms of if the sites are handed over to the HDA, what is the development time frame of developing these military sites. I think at the heart of it, it's not just about Tafelberg. Tafelberg was just a precedent-setting case around how public land should be used. Other parcels of land that are well located should be released for development of housing for people that need housing in this country.
And it's also, I think, very useful when we're talking about the development of the Tafelberg or some of those sites to recognize that some of the most dynamic and vibrant cities in the world are those cities which have made sure they've got a lot of economically integrated neighborhoods where there's not discrimination solely on the price of land, and therefore you only have the rich people. The dynamism of the city often comes from that sort of mixing.
Ms. Anthea, in a minute, because we need to conclude. Your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I think, it's important that we keep a conversation about social housing alive in the country and in our city, because our city is currently growing with people traveling into the city from all other parts of the country, and it's quite celebrated that there's all this immigration. But the effect of that is really that it's excluding poor people more than anyone else. And so social housing really needs to be remain a high priority point of discussion so that we continue to create space in the city in which poor people can live and thrive despite the spatial and economic exclusion that we suffer.
Well, thank you guys for being with me this evening. I think I'm more hopeful for social housing. I mean, rather rent than be on the streets or building a shack somewhere where you don't even have access to anything that's good for you. But that's all we have time for this evening. We spoke to Malcolm McCarthy, consultant, Buhle Boy from Difuno Kwazi, head of political organizing, and Anthea Houston from Communicare CEO, speaking to us about social housing and why it's important. But that's all I have. I'm Farida Rabia and Soke and Cincy, and up next is Reflections with Ayub Ali.